Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 15 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the two positions, beginning with matchups and talking about my top 16 rankings. If you guys want to hear my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description of the video. There are timestamps available there, like in every single video. While you're down in the description, if you've yet to do so already, be sure to subscribe and, of course, click the bell notification button, because besides the daily content, tomorrow's hidden gems, we're also live streaming every single day. Later tonight, after the Rams take on the 49ers, I'll be live here on the channel. If you have any questions in regards to Week 15 lineups or beyond, I'm more than happy to help. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups at the tight end position based on fantasy points allowed between Week 6 through 14 in terms of tight end receiving statistics, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns in a half PPR scoring format. We find that the Raiders, Buccaneers, Panthers, Bengals, Jaguars, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the position, as they're all allowing over 14 plus fantasy points per game on average throughout this span of time. So of course, the idea of potentially playing Kyle Pitts against the Raiders could seem like a pretty solid idea. But again, do you want to risk playing Kyle Pitts in the fantasy football playoffs? Again, high risk, definitely a high reward if in fact it does pan out. I mean, if it wasn't for Kirk Cousins, putting the ball on the wrong shoulder, he potentially scores this most recent week. Either way, just going ahead and giving you guys a perspective as to some of the more advantageous matchups. We'll go into even further detail as I continue on in today's episode talking about these individual players, but we know who our stud tight ends are. Regardless of whether they have an advantageous or disadvantageous matchup, we're typically firing them up anyway. Just wanted to go ahead and show some of the more difficult matchups as well as we approach Week 15. With that all covered, again, a couple reminders. At the end of today's episode, I will be putting together a couple entries via Underdog for tonight's game between the Rams and 49ers. For those of you who are potentially trying to tail set picks, again, be sure to travel down to the description of the video, find the link on over to Underdog. If you sign up today using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to tail these potential entries, but of course, claim the first time deposit offer and get my ranking sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. All you have to be is eligible based on your current location and not use a code in the past. If you're all good on that front, you can take advantage of this opportunity today, or you can go ahead and check out the link down in the description, heading on over to Patreon to find those rankings. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go ahead and begin with my top 16 tight end rankings, beginning with our number one, George Kittle, who takes on the LA Rams later tonight. Look, the fact of the matter is George Kittle hasn't produced less than 12 fantasy points in the last 8 games of this season, if we exclude the Buffalo Bills weather game, in which it was definitely impacting the overall passing game. So outside of that performance, 8 consecutive games in a row of 12 plus fantasy points, coming off of an incredible performance of 151 receiving yards on 6 catches against the Chicago Bears. Later tonight against the Rams, who again have struggled all season long against the tight end position. It's certainly going to be exposed once again, especially considering the running back injuries that have taken place within this offense. It continues to lean Brock Purdy back in the direction of his safety blankets, which is Juwan Jennings and George Kittle. He's an automatic number one play with incredibly high upside. Moving on to our number 2, we have Trey McBride. Now, on Wednesday, he did, in fact, have himself a missed practice, primarily because of a knee injury. We don't know the entire extent of said injury, but hopefully it's just a Wednesday kind of maintenance situation rather than something that is going to be more serious as we progress throughout the remainder of this week. As long as he's healthy and ready to go, he's in our lineups. He's coming off of 3 consecutive games of 12 or more targets. This most recent week against the Seattle Seahawks, 14 targets, 7 catches, 70 yards, 11 of those 14 targets taking place in the second half. Again, he has been able to produce 10 plus fantasy points in a half PPR in 5 of the last 6 games. He's incredibly consistent because the opportunity share continues to go in his direction as the number 1 threat of the Arizona Cardinals passing attack. Number 3, we have David Njoku. Very similar to Trey McBride. Ended up missing practice on Wednesday because of a hamstring injury. If this hamstring injury is going to impact his status going into Sunday, of course, we want to keep that monitored today and tomorrow in terms of his overall practice status and make sure that we have a potential pivoting option in case that David Njoku is not available, because what he's been able to do for our fantasy teams has been incredible, and hopefully he's going to be healthy because he's coming off of the last 2 games of a total of 30 targets. He continues to be one of the primary red zone threats of this offense, scoring himself a touchdown once again this most recent week. Taking on the Chiefs this week should be expected to be an advantageous matchup. They are allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends since week 6, on average of 12.14 in a half PPR scoring format. Continuing on with the S tier, we have Brock Bowers. Even on this most recent week, Brock Bowers had an underwhelming performance of 3 receptions and 49 receiving yards on only 5 targets. It was mainly because Michael Mayer, the backup tight end, had himself his most snaps and routes run the entire season, playing 81% of the snaps and running 29 routes, which again, huge increases in terms of those overall numbers. A lot of 2 tight end sets. Michael Mayer coming away with 9 targets, 7 catches, 68. Now that they've presented the threat of Michael Mayer and teams continue to try to obviously double cover or make Brock Bowers' life a living hell, going into this week, we're going to hope that there's going to be more an expansion of this offense. Desmond Ridder specifically looking in the direction of Brock Bowers on a more consistent rate in comparison to this most recent week in which he had 18 passing attempts, 3 of which only were sent in the direction of Brock Bowers. Again, that's not a great target share. We're hoping against the Atlanta Falcons, a secondary that has struggled all season long, that of course Brock Bowers can find success, especially considering he is functioning out of the slot position more than anywhere on the field. Moving on to our final S-tier tight end, we have Jonnu Smith of the Miami Dolphins. The fact of the matter is, even though he had a quiet Sunday against the New York Jets, going into overtime, all we needed is that touchdown, and he was able to deliver not only a victory for the Miami Dolphins for our fantasy teams, getting himself 3 catches for 44 and a receiving touchdown to end that game. Again, he has scored 4 touchdowns in the last 4 games. As long as that opportunity share within the red zone continues to stay consistent, which is probably going to be the case considering the shootout this week against the Houston Texans, my expectation is that Jonnu Smith continues to stay within this top tier conversation. All right, moving on to the A tier, we have Travis Kelce. Look, the fact of the matter is, Travis Kelce's overall upside has been decimated by Noah Gray's efforts. Over the course of the last 4 games, in every single game, Noah Gray has had 4 receptions or more. As long as those opportunities continue to go in the direction of Noah Gray, the overall upside of Travis Kelce is diminished. Even though they have a fantastic matchup against the Browns, a secondary that can't cover wide receivers nor tight ends, again, allowing over 11 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends recently. Freiermuth scored a touchdown against them this most recent week. The prior time against this Pittsburgh Steelers defense, Freiermuth and the other tight end combined for 7 catches, 73. New Orleans tight ends went for 130 receiving yards. But again, considering this is more of a team effort rather than a singular player benefiting from all the targets, Travis Kelce is a lesser option, but still a must start because he is Travis Kelce. Moving on to our number 7, we have TJ Hockenson, who should have himself a great bounce back performance taking on the Chicago Bears. The Chicago Bears are quite literally the 7th best matchup at the position, allowing nearly 13 fantasy points per game on average. Back in week 12 against this defense, of course, TJ Hockenson, 9 targets, 7 catches, 114 receiving yards, an incredible game. And just this most recent week, we saw George Kittle 6 catches for 151. It's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that TJ Hockenson can show up and ball out against the Chicago Bears defense that quite frankly cannot cover tight ends. Moving on to our number 8, we have Tucker Kraft, who again continues to play well within this offense. He has scored 7 touchdowns in the last 10 games. Honestly, this most recent week against the Detroit Lions, one of the toughest matchups at the position, should have scored a 2nd touchdown if it wasn't for the fact that Jordan Love overthrew him. But we can have that conversation every single week regarding tight ends having missed opportunities because of quarterback play rather than them being open, because typically they are. Nonetheless, taking on the Seattle Seahawks this week, it is one of the best matchups you could possibly ask for. Most recently, Trey McBride has made a career out of taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Most recently, Arizona Cardinals tight ends. In the last 2 matchups against Seattle, 8 catches for 84, 13 catches for 138. Then Buffalo tight end, 6 for 81 and a touchdown. Atlanta, 7 for 65. San Francisco, 5 for 58 and 2 touchdowns. I'm expecting Tucker Kraft to be the next tight end to ball out against the Seattle Seahawks defense. Moving on to our number 9 to begin the B tier. We have Hunter Henry coming off of the bye week. Look, prior to the bye week, his last 3 consecutive games, he's been averaging 9 targets per game, a 24.5% target share. But the only thing that holds back Hunter Henry's overall potential upside for success is Austin Hooper. Again, very similar to Travis Kelce or perhaps even Brock Bowers, there are other tight ends within these offenses that are finding a lot of success. Most recently, the last 2 games, Austin Hooper, 4 catches, 42 and a touchdown, 4 catches, 59 and a touchdown. Again, if we're going to see Austin Hooper continue to siphon value away from Hunter Henry, it certainly will hurt. But Hunter Henry's value in terms of target opportunity and yardage and receptions is still prominent enough to be a startable option once again this week against the Arizona Cardinals. Moving on to our number 10, we have Zach Ertz. The last 3 consecutive games prior to the bye week scored 1 touchdown minimum. He's been able to score himself 11 plus fantasy points in 4 of the last 6 games. We are hoping that in the event in which they take on the New Orleans Saints and blow out the Saints, we're hoping that Ertz is able to find himself either the yardage or the touchdown in order to accomplish a solid 10 plus point week to where we're not worried about him. In the event in which he's not able to score a touchdown because everybody else is, do not be surprised. But hopefully his constant integration within the red zone is going to not be overlooked within the upcoming matchup, because they certainly will be scoring a lot against that New Orleans defense, considering the Saints offense, either with Spencer Rattler or Jake Haener, are probably not going to be able to move the ball very much. Moving on to our number 11 to close out the B tier, we have Pat Freiermuth. Look, the absence of George Pickens just provides more target opportunity. This most recent week, only 3 targets is not enough, but taking on the Philadelphia Eagles in a game in which they'll be having to throw the ball for the entirety of the contest, hopefully there'll be more exposure to opportunity for Pat Freiermuth between the 20s, because down in the red zone, he's been fantastic. He has scored a receiving touchdown in each of the last 2 games. Again, this is going to be a negative game script, so as long as he gets more targets, more receiving yards under his belt, should be a fantastic play at a top 12 capacity. Moving on to our number 12, we have Mark Andrews, also coming off of the bye week. Again, the fact of the matter is, as it currently stands, the Ravens are minus 16-point favorites. Under the assumption that they win, let's say the Baltimore Ravens score 35 points. They score 5 touchdowns. We would assume at least one of those touchdowns have to go in the direction of Mark Andrews, right? Especially considering, okay, let's say we have a Lamar Jackson 2 rushing touchdown game, Derrick Henry 2 rushing touchdowns. If someone's going to catch a touchdown within this offense, Rashad Bateman, Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is probably the favorite to do so. We're going to hope that he's able to find the end zone, find himself with at least 10 fantasy points within the given week in order to continue his streak of success thus far this season. Moving on to our number 13, we have Evan Engram. Look, he's guaranteed to be in a negative game script considering they took on the New York Jets. Again, this offense has functioned at a lesser capacity without Trevor Lawrence, and with Mac Jones turning over the ball on a consistent rate, it's obviously not going to help. But Evan Ingram's going to continue to see targets, and hopefully, considering this is a negative game script in comparison to last week, we will see more targets in his direction. The New York Jets most recently shut down Jonnu Smith up until that overtime period, so hopefully Evan Ingram's going to get a consistent target share and be a mainstay threat within this offense outside of BTJ. Moving on to our number 14, we have Cade Otton, who obviously is no longer the priority threat of this offense and passing game. Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard, Mike Evans getting just as much, even more utilization within this offense. Even in a fantastic matchup this most recent week, 8.5 fantasy points is not going to cut it. Luckily this week, he does take on the Los Angeles Chargers, who have most recently given up 9 catches, 71 to Kansas City tight ends, 6 catches for 50 and a touchdown to Baltimore tight ends, which again, if Cade Otton is able to get himself that lucky receiving touchdown, of course, he'll be significantly better than number 14, but his opportunity share is just not up there as of late. Number 15, speaking of a lack of opportunity share, we re-enter the conversation of Sam LaPorta, who may be coming off of his second best game in terms of total receptions and yards this most recent week against the Green Bay Packers, but now has an opportunity of taking on the Buffalo Bills, which again, a lack of opportunity just won't cut it in the current meta of fantasy football. So in the case of Sam LaPorta, if he's going to get himself his 7 targets once again, fantastic. In the absence of those targets and an absence of a touchdown, he's probably not going to be a top 16 option by the end of this week. But we're going to hope, considering this may be a shootout between these two teams, implicated to be the highest scoring game, he could at least get himself an ample receiving yardage total by the end of the week. Closing out the tight end conversation, we have Jake Ferguson, our number 16, taking on the Carolina Panthers. Even though he did waste a top 5 matchup this most recent week against the Bengals, again, it was his first week back after missing 2 games with the concussion protocol. Hopefully he's back into the overall mix. Taking on the Panthers is the 3rd best matchup at the tight end position. Hopefully Cooper Rush will be looking in his direction far more often in comparison to this most recent performance against the Cincinnati Bengals. All right, that's going to cover my top 16 tight ends. Let's move on to the quarterback conversation with matchups. Between week 6 through 14, the Atlanta Falcons, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Raiders, Patriots, Ravens, Browns, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the quarterback position based on passing statistics isolated, passing yardage, touchdowns, and interceptions. Again, this is in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. Just want to give you a perspective as to some of the more advantageous matchups. Now, of course, the Atlanta Falcons will be taking on Desmond Ridder. We're not firing up Desmond Ridder in our fantasy leagues unless you're playing in a 3 QB league or something of that exchange. Nonetheless, just wanted to go ahead and present some of the more advantageous matchups going into this week. But the fact of the matter is, we know who our stud quarterbacks are. We're going to fire them up this week, and we're going to hope that they've led us to the fantasy playoffs and are going to continue to carry us further and beyond. For those of you who are dealing with a situation in which you're not certain and you're splitting hairs between 2 different quarterbacks, hopefully today's video and hopefully the matchups within the overall conversation can lead you in one direction in a confident manner. Okay, let's go ahead and begin with our number 1. In order to give him respect, I'm going to make Josh Allen the only quarterback this week in the S tier because he's coming off of breaking the record for most fantasy points in a single game by a quarterback, putting up 51.9 fantasy points, 3 passing touchdowns, 3 rushing touchdowns. He has scored a rushing touchdown in 4 consecutive games. And quite frankly, as long as he continues to play as well as he has, now he gets the reinforcements of Keon Coleman, Dalton Kincaid returning. This is expected to be the highest scoring game of the week, taking on the Detroit Lions. With no weather impact indoors, should be an exciting game. Josh Allen continues to ball out, continues to honestly put together gold jacket performances every single week. To begin the A tier, our number 2, we have Lamar Jackson, who takes on, of course, The New York Giants, they are 16-point favorites, like I mentioned earlier with Mark Andrews. If we're going to be in a situation in which they are favored by this much, you may assume, okay, well, Andrew, aren't they going to pull Lamar Jackson in the fourth quarter? Absolutely. But prior to pulling him, they're going to completely blow out this defense, and Lamar Jackson is still going to be fantasy relevant. Earlier this season, when I looked at all the spreads prior to this week, the greatest spread based on Vegas's totals was a -9 favorite against the Denver Broncos earlier this season. In that game, they won 41-10. Lamar Jackson played 89% of the snaps and put up 23.6 fantasy points. So do not worry about Lamar Jackson not scoring. He certainly will prior to him being pulled against the New York Giants defense. Moving on to our number 3, we have Jayden Daniels, the thumbnail of today's episode. Look, Jayden Daniels continues to play well. The last 2 games, 30.4 and 27.6 fantasy points, having scored 3 and 4 touchdowns in those games. Back-to-back weeks in which he is getting rushing touchdowns, primarily because the rushing touchdown upside is correlated with his upside of attempts. With Austin Eckler absent, it's going to lead to more opportunities there. He's had 7+ rushing attempts in 5 of the last 6 games, and as long as he's continuing to run the ball near the goal line, of course, his upside is only going to continue to increase. Taking on the Saints without Derek Carr, expect this to be an absolute one-sided event, and for them to roll this defense. Last time out, Jayden Daniels back in week 13, they put up 21 points in the first quarter. It was like a Madden game there in which they were asking the opponent if they wanted to concede. Going into this week against the Saints very easily could be much of the same. Moving on to our number 4, we have Joe Burrow, who is coming off of another incredible game. 5 consecutive games of 3 or more passing touchdowns. As long as Joe Burrow continues this streak of success, putting up 20+ fantasy points every time out, he has an opportunity of continuing that this upcoming week against the Tennessee Titans, who have allowed 2+ touchdowns in 7 of the last 9 games to opposing quarterbacks. Unfortunately, this most recent week, Mac Jones not capable, but Joe Burrow of all quarterbacks certainly capable, considering he has the best wide receiver in the league at his disposal. And of course, T. Higgins, even though he was ignored last week, still one of the best wide receivers available out there in order for them to dominate this secondary and defense that has not played well and has not been healthy all season long. Moving on to our number 5 to close out the A tier, we have Jalen Hurts. Look, A.J. Brown calling out the offense, Brandon Graham calling out the offense. Everybody is purely aware that they need to throw the ball more. Jalen Hurts only having 108 passing yards this most recent week and still putting up 24.2 fantasy points just gives us an understanding as to regardless of what Jalen Hurts does in the passing game, he is still going to be fantasy relevant because he scores on the ground. Coming off of this most recent performance of 59 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. Again, he has scored 11 rushing touchdowns in the last 8 games he has played within this offense. And if going into this week, the offensive coordinator, the head coach, and Jalen Hurts, they're going to continue to address the passing game. If they're going to expand that and get more involvement of A.J. Brown, expect even more upside out of Jalen Hurts despite the difficult matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Moving on to our number 6, we have Sam Darnold, who's coming off of a legacy game of 5 passing touchdowns, 347 passing yards, an unbelievable performance, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Chicago Bears, who he had a privilege of taking on back in week 12. In that game, 330 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 21.1 fantasy points. Most recently, we have seen other quarterbacks dominate against the Chicago Bears defense. I mean, looking at the most recent schedule for the Chicago Bears, they've taken on Jordan Love, who went for 261 and 2 touchdowns. Jared Goff, 221 and 2 touchdowns. Purdy, 325 and 2 touchdowns with an 80% passing completion percentage. And of course, back in week 12, Sam Darnold. The Bears have been up against it, taking on fantastic quarterbacks. And, Sam Darnold continues that streak once again this week with another great game here. Moving on to our number 7, we have Tua Tagovailoa, who has been incredible since his return. In the last 4 games, he has put up 23+ fantasy points every time out. 23.5, 28.5, 25.2, and 23.5 once again. He's had 300+ passing yards in each of the last 3 games. In each of those 3 games, 2+ passing touchdowns, while maintaining a 76% passing completion percentage. Like I mentioned last week, and I'll continue to harp on, the running game of the Miami Dolphins is averaging less than 3 yards per carry. As long as the running game is no longer an active part and you're taking on the Houston Texans, the second best matchup at the wide receiver position and the 11th best matchup at the quarterback conversation, allowing over 15 fantasy points per game on average to opposing quarterbacks, we would assume Tua Tagovailoa continues his streak within this upcoming shootout. Number 8, we have Brock Purdy. Again, look, Brock Purdy back in week 3 against the Los Angeles Rams in a game in which he went for 292 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 41 rushing yards, and 25.8 fantasy points against his Rams defense. Again, on a 73% passing completion percentage. Brock Purdy had no Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, or Christian McCaffrey. Luckily this week, he has Kittle and Deebo at his disposal. The running back conversation is still up in the air. Going into this week, considering the Rams and 49ers are both in must-win scenarios, expect this to be a high-scoring event on Thursday Night Football. Again, a short week, but should be a fantastic game, especially considering Josh Allen's coming off of a legacy performance. I would assume that Brock Purdy could very easily follow his footsteps and have himself a fantastic game here, considering this Los Angeles Rams secondary has struggled all season long. Moving on to our number 9, we have Jared Goff, who's coming off of 9 of the last 11 games with 2 or more passing touchdowns, has an opportunity of taking on the Buffalo Bills, who have allowed 2 passing touchdowns in 4 of the last 5 games to opposing quarterbacks. This is expected to be the highest scoring game. We just have to hope that Jared Goff doesn't get all of his touchdowns siphoned away by David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. Luckily, this most recent week, Jahmyr Gibbs, his touchdown was scored within the receiving game, which certainly got Jared Goff into the higher upside of his performance with 22 fantasy points. Hopefully, that'll continue once again this week. Moving on to our number 10, Kyler Murray. I've moved him up in comparison to where we were talking about him earlier this week in regards to some of the live streams we've conducted. Of course, coming off a performance of 18 fantasy points, turned over the ball twice, which really hasn't been something that has been common for Kyler Murray thus far this season. He's been efficient in that overall category, but has an opportunity now of taking on the New England Patriots, the 4th best matchup at the quarterback position. The most recent quarterback performances against this defense: Stafford 295 in 4 touchdowns, Tua 317 in 4 touchdowns, Anthony Richardson, even though he had himself a 50% passing completion percentage, 2 passing touchdowns, 48 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. We would assume that Kyler Murray can follow in the footsteps of all these quarterbacks. We just have to hope that James Conner doesn't run away with the game and siphon away all the value from Kyler Murray's upside. Moving on to our number 11, Baker Mayfield, who's coming off of his most recent performance of 3 passing touchdowns. That is the first time that he has had that kind of a performance since the 6-game streak in which he had scored 18 touchdowns in a matter of 6 weeks. Again, going into this week against the Los Angeles Chargers should be an exciting matchup. Again, the Chargers defense has played incredibly well all season long in comparison to where they were last year. But even within this upcoming matchup, I would still expect for Baker Mayfield to be able to expose this defense. We're going to have to wait and see whether or not Bucky Irving is healthy and relevant in this overall matchup. That'll certainly play an impact on the overall upside of Baker Mayfield, because if they have another rushing threat within the red zone, it certainly will impact and potentially lower the overall upside of Baker in those experiences. Moving on to our number 12, we have Matthew Stafford taking on the San Francisco 49ers tonight. Again, I am purely expecting Matthew Stafford to continue his momentum from Sunday, coming off of a game on Sunday against the Buffalo Bills, which in my opinion was one of his best games within a Los Angeles Rams jersey. Taking on the San Francisco 49ers has not been difficult for opposing quarterbacks over the course of this entire season. As long as the run game and the momentum there is going to stay consistent, this 49ers defense has not been able to stop opposing running backs, and that's where it begins and ends with the Los Angeles Rams. As long as they're able to continuously run the ball, opening up the play action to Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, etc., will certainly flow, and I expect him to get his 200 plus yards, 2 touchdowns, and hopefully even more upside within the upcoming performance. Moving on to our number 13, we have Jordan Love. Look, the fact of the matter is, Jordan Love has slowly but surely been getting chipped away at by Josh Jacobs. Jacobs most recently scoring 10 touchdowns in the last 6 games, a game in which he most recently scored 3 rushing touchdowns. That's been chipping away at the fantasy value of Jordan Love. He used to be the typical guy in which you're guaranteed 2 passing touchdowns minimum. Now, if we get that, we're lucky, especially going up against the Seattle Seahawks defense, who has played well as of late. Moving on to our number 14, Bo Nix. I would honestly have Bo Nix way higher, especially considering where I've had him earlier this season. But the fact of the matter is, he no longer runs the ball. He has ditched the running game over the course of the last 4 weeks, getting himself at a maximum 5 rushing yards. Considering this is the case, I'm anticipating less potential upside for Bo Nix going forward. Luckily, this week they do take on the Indianapolis Colts. And if in fact this Denver Broncos defense is able to force many of turnovers from Anthony Richardson, it could even elevate the opportunities for Bo Nix to continue to score over the course of this entire game. Number 15, we have Caleb Williams. Again, he takes on the Minnesota Vikings back in week 12 against the Vikings. 32 of 47 passing, a 68% passing completion percentage, 340 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 33 rushing yards, 26.9 fantasy points. Most recently, we have seen quarterbacks like Kirk Cousins, 344 yards against Minnesota. Murray, 260. Levis, 295. The passing yardage is going to be there. We just have to hope that he's able to complete some touchdowns in the direction of his fantastic wide receivers, which I'm certainly expecting him to be able to do so. Closing out the quarterback conversation, we have our number 16, Anthony Richardson. Look, we can get 2 different types of Anthony Richardson. We can get one that scores the rushing touchdowns and saves his whole week, or we can get one that ditches the running game and is being brutalized within the passing game. In the last 2 games, Anthony Richardson has been 23 of 52 passing at 44% passing completion percentage, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Denver Broncos. Again, the Denver Broncos technically are the 10th best matchup at the quarterback position based on their recent efforts, obviously getting torched by Jameis Winston just a couple weeks ago. But the fact of the matter is, going into this week, we are hoping for upside in terms of touchdowns on the ground in in order to save his week and get him a baseline of production so that regardless of what he does through the air, it's just going to be gravy on top of his overall fantasy point workload. Now, I could have put other quarterbacks here, such as Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, etc., but I do feel more confident regarding Anthony Richardson because of his rushing upside within the upcoming matchup, especially down within the red zone, with all of his fantasy pieces returning. Obviously, his offensive line a little bit banged up, but I'm not too worried about that overall situation. Okay, that's going to cover it for the quarterback conversation. I wanted to close out today's episode by sharing a potential entry in regards to tonight's game. This entry regarding George Kittle, Puka Nacua, and Juwan Jennings. Okay, George Kittle going higher than 3.5 receptions. He's been able to accomplish this in 9 of the last 10 games, and that excludes the Buffalo Bills game in which it was a heavy weather impacted game. 9 of the last 10 games having 4 or more receptions within this offense. Fantastic. Puka Nacua going higher than 5.5 receptions. In all healthy and non-ejected games thus far this season, he's accomplished this in 5 of the last 6, coming off of a performance of 12 receptions on 14 targets. Then we go ahead and close out with Juwan Jennings, higher than 4.5 receptions, going higher in 5 of the last 5 games, excluding the Bills game, of course, heavy weather. 5 of the last 5 games in which he has played 80+% of the snaps. Last time out against the Los Angeles Rams, 11 total receptions, 175, and 3 touchdowns. We would assume continued success from all 3 of these receivers in a hopefully high-scoring matchup between these 2. All right, that's going to cover it for today's episode. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, there's a link down in the description. Head on over to Underdog if you guys want to go ahead and potentially follow these plays and or go ahead and get my rankings. You can do that via Underdog or Patreon. Thank you very much. I'll be back later tonight after the game via live stream. So if you guys have any questions, be sure to swing on by. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.